We have observed in the last 20 years a very definite change in the relationships between the peoples of the earth. Probably the most dramatic change that we are able to notice is the relationship between Western culture and the total structure of humanity. Up to 20 years ago, the West was the undisputed leader of the world in nearly all phases of life. Western ways, Western thoughts, Western methods were copied, were regarded as the most advanced, and were almost universally admired. Now this has changed, and little by little, world conditions have eroded away the foundation of Western culture. While we do not like to emphasize this point or really think about it, we are faced with it, and we are in the embarrassing situation of gradually losing our supremacy in the various areas of man's thinking and living. Perhaps there is no area in which our supremacy was as deeply rooted or as strongly upheld as the area of religion. For nearly 2,000 years, we have assumed that our religion would ultimately convert the whole earth. We built upon this foundation. We psychologically sustained ourselves with the conviction that it was predestined and foreordained that our way of life would ultimately convert all other ways of life. There are many periods in our development when this could have been true. But in one way or another, we seem to have lost a great deal of our spiritual leadership as well as our temporal leadership. One of the reasons, perhaps, for this difficulty is that the recent emergencies which have risen around the world have been equally disastrous to Western man and to Eastern man. The East, looking to the West, has not found that we were able to carry our own problem adequately. And the West, looking to the East, has come to the same conclusion. Most of the great monuments of culture, which were supposed to ensure the securities of peoples, have failed under the stress of present world conditions. It appears more, therefore, that we stand together, East, West, North, and South, in one dilemma. And up to the present moment, there does not appear to be any clear solution to this dilemma. And peoples of various cultures, observing their own and those of their neighbors, can no longer sense that somewhere there is an adequate leadership. The whole concept of cultural leadership has more or less disintegrated. It is therefore quite reasonable that peoples of other beliefs should follow the example which we set. We went out to bring to the whole world our good tidings of great joy. We brought them, and nobody seems to be very joyful about it, including the folks that brought them. Therefore, it is quite possible that we are now going to see something that we never lived to hope or expect to see, namely that other people are going to try and save us. Now, this seems to be the last insult of a difficult generation. And in religion, this is particularly embarrassing, because we move from the commonplace to the utterly unique. Each religion feels its own curious and powerful uniqueness. Not long ago, I received some newspapers from Pakistan, where prominent educators and political leaders are gathering their resources to try and help us spiritually. We are assured at the present time that in various parts of the Asiatic hinterland, the most remote and we might say underprivileged regions of the earth, prayers for our salvation are going up to gods we do not even know the names of. Well, let's not reject these prayers. We are definitely in need of something, and maybe that is it. I remember Lowell Thomas bringing us the message of the Dalai Lama of Tibet, in which this young but rather brilliant and remarkable person has assured us that the prayers of Tibet are with us. I think we need them. Some way we need something that we do not currently find available. We are also receiving as much spiritual help as we are willing to take from Hinduism. And more missionaries of these beliefs are coming over into the wilderness of the West to try to sow some seeds of culture. 25 years ago, this would have been a rather humorous situation. We would have taken it very tolerantly, perhaps, because that, for the most part, is our way. But we would have regarded these missionaries leaving behind all that was solid, staple, secure, peaceful, to come into the desolate wilderness of Western civilization. We would have regarded them with amusement or pity. Today we do not know just how to regard them. And more of our people are being influenced by the messages that are coming to us from elsewhere. We also realize that a powerful counterstream continues to flow into areas which we can reach. But at the present time, most of the great missionary fields of 50 years ago are closed to us. These people are no longer being initiated into our concepts or our ways of life. It would then appear that there is a certain impasse that affects not only our industrial relationships, but our cultural and religious foundations. We are informed, for example, were in an article not long ago that if we make an invention today, the Japanese will improve on it and sell it back to us cheaper than we can produce it ourselves. We find foreign labor problems encroaching upon the American concept of work. Incidentally, this concept of work has been growing rather dim in the West. Work is at the present time a kind of an unhappy chore that we do not engage in unless it is absolutely necessary. So little by little, viewpoints change. And in the midst of this changing, shifting pattern of culture, we are somewhat amazed to find learned works appearing, careful research projects being set up by other people in other parts of the world to try to find out what is wrong with us. This diagnosis is not always entirely satisfying to our thinking, but the detached observer often comes to some very valuable conclusions. Among the most brilliant Eastern scholars today is Dr. Suzuki. He is a man who exemplifies an East-West understanding quite different from the sentimentalism of the Western enthusiast or the continuing pressure of the Western missionary. Dr. Suzuki is an elderly man. He has had a very long life. He has become an expert in one of the most difficult sciences or arts of Eastern religion, and that is Zen. He has furthermore been a careful and thoughtful observer of the Western life way, and has for a number of years been lecturing at Columbia University. He is a member of the Japanese Academy and brings to his viewpoints a scholarship that is equal to anything that we can produce here in the West. Perhaps one of the most fascinating thoughts in connection with Dr. Suzuki is that here we have a man of deep educational insight who has attained distinction in world leadership, who is most articulate in the English language, and who is a man generally respected for his erudition throughout the world. Yet this man has dared to make a specialty in a field still largely neglected in the West, and that is religious philosophy. He dares to be an idealist. He dares to think in terms of man's spiritual need. And yet he does this, or does these things, in a way that forces our attention. In a great many respects, Dr. Suzuki reminds me of Carl Jung in his approach to life, in his thought. And in fact, Dr. Jung has at least one occasion written an introduction to one of Dr. Suzuki's books. So we are not concerned too much with the abilities of Dr. Suzuki. These are established. But we are interested when he does a book comparing Buddhist and Christian mysticism. He comes to Christianity, obviously, as a non-Christian. 50 years ago, this would have meant there would have been no sale for his book in the United States. Now it is selling very nicely, thank you, because it is reaching into the lives of these people who, as Dr. Suzuki himself points out, are troubled in the core of their own lives. They are troubled by situations for which they have no reasonable solution. He does not, however, go on to make an odious comparison between Eastern and Western ways. He is too good a scholar for this. He points out certain things which he believes to be true, but he does not, in any sense of the word, attempt to proselyte on Western man. He would, however, like to suggest that there is something that Western man should be thinking about. And he also is not beyond noting that there are things that Eastern man should be thinking about. Perhaps Dr. Suzuki is attempting to establish the foundations of a world philosophy of life. He senses the great need for it, and he is quite certain that it cannot be accomplished except through a union of that which is known. Dr. Suzuki is not, however, interested in a merely sentimental tolerance between peoples. He realizes that it is far too late for this. He also realizes that tolerance is one of the most evident signs of intolerance. Where we tolerate things, it simply means that we attempt to convey the idea that we are broad-minded, when in fact we are not at all. Tolerance means that we are right, but we're willing to let the other fellow live if he insists on doing it. This is not the basis of any real understanding. What we have to have in the future is a rekindling, a relighting of the great fires of human purpose. fires that have burned very low and under the pressure of existing situations threaten to be entirely extinguished. In his effort to find a solution to this, it is perfectly natural and proper that Dr. Suzuki should take refuge in his own commitment, which is Zen. However, as he points out, Zen is only a word meaning a process. Zen is not a creed. It is not a cult. Zen is an attitude. Therefore, Zen can be involved in the attitudes of any people without taking them from their own root cultures. Zen is a way of looking at everything. And the learned doctor suspects that every man, everywhere, should begin to look, to seek with a new inner sense of sight for the foundations of his enduring philosophy. Dr. Suzuki expresses, therefore, considerable amazement, and this is a rather naive point of view, but profundity and naivete go together in Eastern thinking. The great wise people of the East have all been very childlike, and the same has largely been true of the most enlightened people of the West. Great depth of learning brings a gentle simplicity to living, and comes gradually to simply ignore the confusions and complexities that might disturb the inner tranquility of life. So with rather a childish point of view in this respect, Dr. Suzuki made a discovery. He discovered that there were some mystics in the West who seemed to be pretty good exponents of Mahayana Buddhism. He is acknowledgedly surprised. It never has occurred to him, or did not, up to the time when he began to give this matter serious consideration, that the very roots of the solution to our problem are also in our own culture as well as in his, and that on a common ground we could achieve a great deal. In other words, if the East was true to its philosophy and the West was true to its philosophy, we would both be believing the same thing already. And this is a point which comes as a distinct shock to us, because we have never assumed that such a union was possible without conversion. In other words, either we had to be converted or they had to be converted. That both have already the roots of the solution in their own ways of life would perhaps astonish a good many pro-Western peoples. So in his studies of Western mysticism, Dr. Suzuki came upon a personality which we discussed here not long ago, and that was the great German mystic Meister Eckhart. He discovered in Eckhart a really kindred spirit. He realized that under the pressure of Western theology, this spirit could not unfold as rapidly or as easily or as smoothly as among Eastern mystics. But in Eckhart was a person who possessed insight. Eckhart was not only a mystic in the more sentimental meaning of the term, he was a mystic in the Zen sense. He was a mystic with a tremendous dynamic and with a very sharp sword of spiritual reality. And Dr. Suzuki quotes quite freely from the writings of Meister Eckhart in his establishment of an East-West concept of mysticism. Dr. Suzuki, pointing out the foundations of religion, brings several points into focus. First of all, if we think, as he says, of Eastern religion, whether we agree with it or not, whether we accept it or not. We are inclined to think of something serenely aloof, quietly detached. We do not think of Eastern religion in terms of great aggressive movements. We do not think of Eastern religion in terms of a militant revivalism. We cannot imagine in the East a phenomenon like that of Billy Graham. The Eastern mind just doesn't work that way. In the East, there are no sawdust trails, and there are very few indications of frightening a man into a state of grace. This is not an Eastern phenomenon. In the East, the tendency is to consider religion as quietude, religion as a very warm, peaceful search for value. Most of the images of Mahayana Buddhism, particularly in Japan, which is Dr. Suzuki's homeland, are either of a mild and pleasing nature, or else, if they have been inherited from some earlier East Indian source and still reserve or keep some of their gruffness or their apparent violence of appearance, the people themselves have long since interpreted all this violence out of them and regard the so-called grim and menacing images merely as the defenders of principles or as man's own shadow, man's own darkness, leading him astray. Therefore, to the East, these images of a more gruesome appearance, at least, simply suggest man as the departer from truth, and truth in turn slowly but grimly but inevitably bringing man back again to the consideration of the great values of existence. So we are most inclined to think of Zen as old Daruma huddled in his cloak, meditating toward a blank wall, and also to assume with this posture that there is in Eastern religion something strangely negative. And this, of course, is our last refuge against being converted to something else. We have come to the conclusion that Eastern man simply is less active, less determined, less resourceful, less certain of his course and way, and is lacking in those admirable ambitions upon which we build career. Of course, we are beginning to doubt this apathy in our Japanese neighbors, who seem to be rolling up their sleeves and doing a remarkable job of a number of things under many limitations that we do not suffer from. We are therefore mildly astonished at the economic restoration of Japan in the years following World War II. We open our eyes with a measure of surprise when we learn that the city of Tokyo has outrun New York and London and is now the largest city in the world, and also one of the best built and equipped cities. These things make us begin to wonder whether we can depend upon Oriental apathy, whether we can assume that these Eastern nations are going to doze their way through the ages while we continue to dominate the world. There seems to be some doubt about this, and the doubt is taking very positive shape. How then are we to look at this Eastern way, as perhaps Dr. Suzuki might invite us to look at it? Certainly we see the quiet, meditating figures of the Buddha, with his gaze upon some eternity beyond our comprehension. We have already come to know the gracious figure of Kannan, deity of compassion. We have come to like very much kindly Jizo standing on the roads that guard the courses of men. We're beginning to sense the simplicity and dignity of Shibui. we begin to think more and more of Japanese architecture, the simplicity of the Japanese home, the wonderful use of natural materials, and the perfect willingness of the Japanese intellectual to allow his home to sink into its environment, rather than to make it stand out like a bandaged thumb on the landscape. These changes begin to mean quite a lot to us. And we are affected by them perhaps mostly in the terms of a certain tranquility, a certain gentleness, a certain kindliness that these surroundings seem to stimulate within our own thought and emotion. On this ground, then, Dr. Suzuki points out that the Mahayana tradition especially, and in this book the doctor goes beyond Zen to study at least in part the whole structure of Northern Buddhism, or what we might term here in the West the idea of Protestant Buddhistic thinking. He comes to the conclusion that this archetype, this vision, this picture of quietude, of integration, of a person not aggressive, but always giving the peculiar sense of being immovable. The individual who cannot be swept away by storm or stress, but has no storm or stress in himself. The individual who wins by a certain inevitability, which has come to dominate his thoughts and his emotions. To Dr. Suzuki, this suggests perhaps something of the Buddhistic archetype, the Buddhistic thought, the pattern underlying the entire concept. And by contrast, he points out that our Western religions, from the very beginning, have been religions of stress. From the earliest period of our religious history in the West, religion has been fighting for survival against something. It fought against the Egyptians, it fought against the Assyrians, it fought against the Romans. And its entire early history is a history of struggle, of wandering in wilderness, of strife, and of a continual record of disobedience continually punished. A scholar has noted that this to a great degree is the story of the Old Testament, which is little more than an account of the wanderings of a people striving desperately to preserve their faith against tremendous external forces, and then later to protect their faith against the weaknesses and corruptions in their own natures. These points to Dr. Suzuki are somewhat distasteful. He is just not a man of that kind. Now, we may say that he's wrong, but the point that we are interested in making at the moment is, this is his viewpoint. With the rise of Christendom, the struggle went on. The earliest profane histories of Christianity deal with the martyrdom of Christians in the Circus Maximus, the struggle of the early faith to survive the mysteries and tragedies of an early pagan environment, and then gradually the struggle of the church to survive itself, to divide the heretics from its own ranks, and to continuously persecute these heretics. The church in turn being again and again persecuted itself, so that down through the ages comes a vision of Western religion, a religion of continual defensiveness, a defensiveness that has written into the subjective structure of our faith the militant orthodoxy which we know. This orthodoxy is not something that the individual seems to feel that he needs. This orthodoxy is an armament against a continual enemy, against the pressure of everything contrary to his faith. And gradually it has become an armament against the pressure of the very denominations of his own religion. Out of all this, then, has come the concept that when you look at the structure of Western religion, as perhaps Dr. Suzuki, as a non-Westerner, sitting rather quietly in his own bamboo grove, would look at it, he sees in the West not the quietude and composure of a deep, warm, continuing conviction of value. He sees in the West a continual striving, a symbol of Christianity associated from the beginning with suffering, with martyrdom, and with death, and the assumption that only through suffering, martyrdom, and death the final spiritual triumph can be achieved. I don't like to speak for Dr. Suzuki, but I would assume from his book that Dr. Suzuki is not convinced that this psychology of religion, based upon man achieving virtue by way of suffering alone, or dominantly suffering, by way of continuing self-denial, through the abnegation of his own normal humanity, and his tremendous dedication in terms of pain to a conviction. I do not think he feels that this is an adequate religious point of view. I think he feels that it is essentially the kind of a religious point of view that might cause a people to be equally aggressive in everything else, and building upon a philosophy or religion of continual strife, of continual struggle against the pressures of circumstance, that this in turn would lead to a very aggressive egoism, that it would lead also to industrial strife, political strife, artistic, musical, and cultural strife, that it would undermine the entire tranquility of our way of life, and might very well end Western man's history with the story of a universal and almost complete frustration. This frustration resulting from the inevitable tragedy of inevitable force striking immovable object. This situation, he feels, has a deep bearing not only upon our religion, but upon our total way of life. It is responsible, perhaps, for this attitude that our faith must be the best, our merchandise must be the best, our homes must be the most elaborate, and the constant status struggle for wealth and popularity, fame, advancement, because we have built our whole way of life upon these aggressive patterns of rolling up our sleeves and fighting our way through obstacles. Now, if we go back to Zen for an understanding of a fighting through of obstacles, what do we actually find? According to the rather simple and perhaps inscrutable way of the East, a man fighting his way through an obstacle is simply an individual fighting his way through himself. In other words, the obstacle is not society. The obstacle is not the world. The obstacle is not even the unknown. The obstacle is the fact that the subject of Western man must have an object. There must be some reason for an individual to continually fight against something, to attain an almost universal neurosis on the subject of defense and offense. To be able to be a successful soldier, there must be an occasional war. And where a large military force is held in readiness or kept in training, and there is no war, there is a serious difficulty likely to arise. The large, ready army is almost certain to find a war, and a powerful, adamant, ambitious, aggressive person must have an object against which to turn his resources and his energies. So in Zen, the world obstacle arises out of the world ambition itself. There isn't any obstacle. We create the obstacle. And by various indoctrinations over a long period of time, we have left the world in a condition where it does not know better than to allow itself to create obstacle. And this is just exactly as true of the communistic writings of Karl Marx as almost any other type of subject that we can contact. Always there must be an enemy. Always there must be the reason for a holy war. There must be a crusade against something. And anyone who does not believe that the present communistic movement is a holy war simply doesn't understand Karl Marx. Because actually Marx has taken the religious emotions of man and simply moved them into a social pattern and given the individual a new crusade. But it is the same crusading instinct that it always was. The ancient saints may no longer be upon the icons in Russia, but the new faces, far from sanctified, have become the new saints. And this is true wherever we have a great conflict moving through the consciousness of man. So the doctor suggests we pause for a moment and take a little stock of the substance of this conflict. In the first place, if we were devout Christians, if we really lived our religion, we wouldn't have this conflict. And most non-Christian people surveying the situation have come to the same conclusion. If we really believed that our universe was created by a good God, that throughout its entire existence it is in the keeping of a heavenly Father, and that this deity is capable at any time of any necessary intercession, and that this world is therefore eternally forever the production of a deity capable of controlling and directing it, we wouldn't all be out trying to take on God's work for him. If we believed that right would triumph, we would be satisfied to do right, but we are not. If we believed that through prayer, through meditation, through inner life, through the simple acceptance of the Christian ministry, we would find out our own spiritual salvation, we would be doing these things. But such is not the case. And out of the very core of Western Christianity has risen one of the most positive and dramatic agnosticisms and even atheisms in the world today. We're just not practicing what we preach. And the only answer can be that we do not believe it. We accept it, but we do not believe. To make this situation a little clearer then, the East has this reputation for a strange spiritual detachment. The West has a reputation in all corners of the world for a very strange material attachment. So we have two highly conflicting cultures, and each one points to the other as an example of that which must inevitably fail. Perhaps our own way of life is a little more dramatic, inasmuch as, for the last century at least, we have rather dominated world affairs. We have played a tremendous part in the shaping of the destiny of non-Christian peoples. We have for a long time controlled the roads of traffic and commerce between the East and West. Our ships sailed the sea to all the ports of the distant world. Yet this 100 years of undisputed leadership by the West has not accomplished a true civilization for either the East or the West. And at this moment, the undisputed leadership seems to be threatening the very survival of the whole world. For it is out of our Western ingenuity that the most dangerous instruments of destruction we have ever known have been formulated. So if Dr. Suzuki is not applauding Western ways too loudly, he has ground for his reservations, as most thoughtful persons in the West realize at this time. This idea that we have, that only by a continual active flow of libido can we get anywhere, is beginning to sum up in the simple fact that this constant flow of libido is getting us somewhere, but not where we want to go. It is bringing us closer and closer to the brink of chaos. If then we recognize that many centuries of basically wrong orientation have produced nothing to justify themselves, that we have not attained any of the ends which we originally sought, and that we have gradually come to accept compromises, the most important compromise being the substitution of wealth for happiness. If these compromises in themselves are going stale, and if today we are producing a generation of peoples comparatively hopeless, without any principles, without any foundations to guide them, without any securities on which to build, it has now reached the point where our insecurity is beginning to threaten the security of other peoples, and where, just as surely as we view with alarm the spread of communism throughout the world, other non-communistic peoples with a devout desire to have some form of security are beginning to be alarmed at us, for they feel that our psychology of wealth at the expense of principle is as dangerous to ultimate survival as communism is. Either one of these solutions is less than a Chinaman's choice. Whichever way it goes, there is nothing ahead but trouble. Dr. Suzuki then brings out his own little story, that there is a level of thinking in all parts of the world, but perhaps this level is more available in two faiths, Buddhism and Christianity, than among the other more austere and more segregated beliefs.